Hey there, welcome back to another episode of the Working Mumma podcast. I hope you're going really well. I had last week off on holidays, took the family to the snow, and it was just the break that I needed. I mentally switched off. It was awesome. Also, really good to connect and also see my two boys loving skiing as much as what I do. This week, I have pretty much my number one bucket list person for the Working Mumma podcast. I have to say, I've been able to tick this off. It's Dr. Sophie Brock. I have been looking to actually have her on the show for a number of years. And finally, I actually worked up the courage to invite her on. And I was very excited when she said yes. So, if you don't know Dr. Sophie Brock, she's a motherhood studies sociologist and is very much a go-to expert on all things motherhood. And I absolutely love this chat. Yes, you may hear a little voice throughout it. My little man just wasn't playing ball during this. But it really humanizes everything as well, as what Sophie and I talk about. As always, if you are able to leave a rating or review, that would be absolutely sensational. Really appreciate it. And let's get into today's episode with Sophie. Welcome to the Working Mumma podcast, a show that provides real-world tips, tricks, and advice to all working mamas on how they can have a career, family, and hopefully one day break the glass ceiling. Welcome, Sophie. Welcome to the Working Mumma podcast. How's your day going so far?
Thanks for having me, Karina. Yeah, my day's going pretty well. My daughter was off on an excursion this morning for school, so it was a bright and early one. And in some ways, I thought to myself, oh, this will allow me to get more work done. And what I listened to my body and I was like, actually, I need some rest. So I went back to bed for an hour and a half after I dropped her at school. So my day's had a nice, gentle start to it.
Very good for a Monday morning of when we're recording this. Well, now it's Monday afternoon. So, Sophie, those are people that don't know you, which I'm sure many, many people listening already do. How would you best describe yourself?
So, I always love even dissecting that question a little bit because it kind of proves the point of the way that I work. And so even that question of how would you describe yourself, that's asking us to think about who is listening to this description, what parts of our life are important to us, what do we do for work, because that so often defines our identity in our society. And so what I do and part of who I am is I am a mother to my daughter who's just turned 7, and I also run my business. And it started off actually as a business called Mother, Daughter, Woman. And with those three, I'm trying to encapsulate actually different parts of identity. So in, I guess, simpler terms, I'm a motherhood studies sociologist. And what that means is that in the same way that a scientist would go out and study the environment or take a specimen and bring it back to their lab and look at it under a microscope and use that inquiry to answer some questions that they might have about this specimen or organism. As a social scientist, what we do is we go out into the world, which is kind of like our lab, and we conduct research by listening to people's stories. And I do that specifically for mothers. So my PhD looked at mothers who have children with disabilities, and I was interested in what's their experience of the world like, not because it serves purpose and the importance of their children, because that's what a lot of research looks at is, well, we're interested in mums because of their kids. Actually, what's it like for them? What's their sense of identity? How does that come to be? And so I've brought all of that knowledge and inquiry into my business to try and get this information out there to mums more broadly, to understand how the broader world we live within impacts their individual experiences as mums. So that's a roundabout way of describing what I do, Karina.
And such important work as well. And, probably if you went back maybe 10, 20 years ago, there wasn't as much research focused in on mums and things like that. So there was, say the amazing baby brain is what everyone said. But I know that also has been recently debunked, that myth, which is thanks to, research like yourself and others are also doing in this space, which is also so important.
Yeah, it's very much has been and continues to be a marginalized area of academic focus and research because of multiple reasons. And I think actually sometimes the pushback that people who work in this space academically receive of, why are you interested in mothers? For what purpose is that? Is it because you want to be a mother? Is it because you are a mother? Is it like this suspicion sometimes around an inquiry and a focus on mothers' experiences actually proves the very point of why researchers are looking into this, and we need more attention and focus. And thankfully now there has been a kind of booming of maternal-based research and inquiry in the last 30 years or so, but it hasn't always been like that. And even the work that is out there now, you have to fight to get it heard and platformed. It's not seen as this kind of juicy, exciting theme within institutions, but you talk to any mother out there and anyone who's invested in the care and well-being of mothers, and we know that this work is important because mothers are struggling massively, and their health and well-being is integral to our society and our economy's health and well-being as well.
Definitely. And I know a lot of posts and information that you share, I often read it myself. And it's very validating of going, yes, that's exactly what I'm thinking or I'm feeling. So it may, from a research, I guess, from a business perspective, not always be, the juicy information, but to, 51% of the population, which are women, and 86% of women are going to be mothers, it is validating for them as well in that process.
Yeah, so that's exactly right. If you think about the vast majority of our population, not only experience motherhood themselves, right, in becoming mothers. And I also get so intrigued when people frame motherhood as this niche topic, because it's like we all have been mothered in some way. We all know a mother, love a mother, interact with a mother. So it's not really niche at all. It's at the foundation of a lot of what.
Yeah, it's really validating, I think, as well. And so how did you get into this? What's your career journey? Because I always find people's career journey and how they got to where they are, and also what inspired you to study this is really interesting.
So I've always had an interest in women's inner lives, actually. Even from the time that I was in high school, I was always invested in projects that looked at the inner workings of our lives. And I've kept a diary myself since I was a little girl. And so the process of writing and journaling has always been really intriguing and important in my life. And in the process of one project, actually in year 12, at the end of high school, I looked at the diaries of Sylvia Plath and Kathleen Folbig. And Kathleen, yeah, I won't go into the details about both of them. But basically, they were writing a lot about their mothering journey. And so through this process, I was getting this insight into the inner world of mothers and the things that were important to them, the things that were hard for them. And so when I went into university, I had a focus on women's stories and experiences. I ended up majoring in sociology. And in one of my projects, in I think my third year, we had a course on symbolic violence. And part of what I was interested in looking at actually was a topic. And so when I was in this process of looking at topics to study, actually one of the topics that was of interest to me that came up, which hadn't had a lot of research done on it at that point, were the experiences of mothers who were quote unquote bad mothers, mothers who had killed their babies and children, right? Infanticide. So I was really curious at how they were positioned through like court transcripts, through public discussion, through the media, on actually bringing to the surface good mothering and bad mothering language. So as I was kind of going down the rabbit hole of this in the context of this university course, I found the work of Professor Andrea O'Reilly. And Andrea O'Reilly is the founder of Motherhood Studies. And by connecting with her work and her, at the time, organization, it allowed me to have opened to me this whole area of maternal scholarship and literature that I hadn't been exposed to for the whole 3 years of my degree. And that got me really curious, like, hang on a second, why have we not had access to any of this? Why has there not been any focus on mothers throughout my degree and all these different courses that I've taken? And so that then led me to actually wanting to pursue an honours year, which is similar to a master's, and have a deep dive research project. And when I was trying to figure out which topic I wanted to land on for that research project, something that intrigued me were the experiences of mothers who have children with disabilities. And long story short, part of where that came from is because my dad was diagnosed with motor neuron disease when I was 5 years old, a little girl, and he was given a 3 to 5 year diagnosis of how long he had left to live. And so throughout my childhood, amazingly, he lived for 20 years. But it's a progressive disease that meant that he slowly lost capacity and his independence. And I saw my mum need to take on more and more of a caring role, and my sister and I did as well. So I had lived and witnessed the importance of caregiving. And I thought, what would this be like if you have a child with a disability? And when I started to look at the literature, a lot of it, bar a couple of people, were focused on let's look at the mothers because of how they impact their children. And I really wanted to switch the lens and focus to say, let's look at mothers in and of themselves, their own experiences. So that led to my PhD area. And then out of that came a theory, which then was the foundation of my business, which looks at how society impacts our lived experience and how we can also shape culture through our mothering. So that's a little bit of a summation of where my research interests have come from and what has landed me ultimately in this space.
What powerful work, and also what a powerful story in areas that you often don't actually see and hear about. Sophie, you were just saying about how much, like, I guess those social influences have really shaped some of your research. Why do you think there are such cultural and also societal norms that shape, the pressure for mothers to be perfect? Because there's this real notion, I don't know what it is at the moment, but you've got to be this perfect mom. I don't know if it's because of social media influences and things like that, but there's this real notion around, and I know that it really is quite overwhelming for pretty much every mum that I speak to, of you've got to be able to do this, you should be doing that, and your kids should be doing this. And you're like, oh my God, I just want to be my mom, like be a mum. So it's full on. So where does it all come from? And what are all these norms, and what influence is it having on us today?
Yeah, so really, because we're social creatures, social norms are always going to impact and influence us. And that happens in every domain of our lives, not just as mothers, but it's particularly heightened and accentuated for mothers. And I'll explain briefly this theory that came out of my PhD that I've adapted and used in all my work is kind of at the foundation of it that helps to answer your question. And that is to actually suspend our imagination in the moment, because I'm going to draw an analogy which sometimes sounds a bit odd at first, but it's between mothers and fish, right? So part of what we're imagining is this round glass fish tank, and that is representative of our society. So that's the world we live within. And the water inside is the culture. So when I say those things to you, like society and culture, it can feel really vague and ambiguous. It's like, what are we actually talking about here? So this is what this analogy helps to kind of break down for us as mothers. And so as mothers, we're the fish inside the tank. Okay, so we're swimming around in this water of our culture that is structured by society, and we're the individual mothers swimming around. The swimming is our mothering as a practice. And so when I say society, what I'm talking about are institutions like the maternity system, the hospital system, the schooling system, the family is a system. Right, our relationships as well are part of that structuring. Media and advertising make up our culture. So when we're little girls ourselves, when we're babies actually, we go through this process of socialization into what are social norms and rules and customs. So in the same way that, we're here in Australia, if you meet someone, you might say, "Hey, how are you going?" When you say, "Hey, how are you going?" there's a kind of shared understanding that that is a greeting. It's not a genuine asking of, "I want to sit here and am opening space for you to tell me how you really are." Often it's just a little social custom. Same with a wave. You wave at someone, they wave back. You shake hands, right? These are things. You cover your mouth when you sneeze or you cough. Like, these are things that are actually social rules that aren't just natural. They come about, and we come to practice them through socialization and social training. And as mothers, we're actually doing a lot of that with our children. And so we are actually taught and absorb and pick up particular social rules around what it means to be a mother. And those things come about through how you were mothered yourself. So the example that your mother gave of what it was to be a mother, comments that you might overhear other people make about, "Oh, I can't believe she's gone back to work so early. I could never do that with my baby." Or, "You don't have children just for someone else to raise them." Or, we could pull apart a ton of different social scripts and phrases that we have about motherhood. It comes, yes, through our social media now, that's really prevalent. It has always been, though, communicated through advertising and media. through advertisements, through the radio, through movies, through pop culture, music. And it also comes about through our lived experience relationships of the judgment that we may receive and the feedback that we get around how we're doing as mothers. So it comes from the outside in and it comes from the inside out. So when we're these fish swimming around in this water, we're absorbing these social rules around what it means to be a mother. And when we become mothers ourselves, we kind of cross this threshold, but it's not as if we immediately are given this rule book on what it means to be a good mother. We've been kind of socialized and taught these rules from when we're children ourselves. So part of what this means is that there have always been social rules about what it means to be a good mother. So this fish tank, the tank itself, has always been there. We can't jump out of it, but it changes form. So the rules around what it means to be a good mother that we're facing today are slightly different than the rules that our mothers faced, that our grandmothers faced, that our great-grandmothers faced. And so our context really shapes what it means to be a good mother. There was a time when being a good mother actually meant disconnection from our children in some way. Children are meant to be seen and not heard. I send you out and I shut the door, and what it means to be a good mother actually has a more central focus on what it means to be a good wife. And what it means to be a good homemaker. And so interestingly, for our generation, we kind of are dealing with the repercussions of that era. We've taken some of that on in terms of domesticity, our homes being a reflection of how good a mother we are. But we've also got an added layer of intensive mothering ideology, which actually started kind of post-World War II, but ramped up in the early 1990s. And this is a theory by someone called Sharon Hayes. And what that has done is it's meant that not only are we to be the perfect homemakers, the perfect wife, also now the perfect employee or the perfect businesswoman, or we've got those pressures of career added on top as well. But also, we're meant to dedicate 24/7 to our children. We're meant to be playing with them, constantly engaging with them. We're meant to be constantly attuned to them. We're meant to be constantly present. And then we have this huge amount of guilt if we can't, and usually it's not even if, it's when, because no one can sustain this, when we aren't able to fulfill all of these social and cultural ideals that we've been swimming around in. And so the big motivation for me in having these conversations and doing my work more broadly is to help us make visible that we're in the tank, and to help us make visible that we're in that water and that we've been swimming in it for a long time, and that a lot of the guilt that we feel is not ours to carry. It's guilt that's been loaded onto our shoulders because of the social context of motherhood, and there's a lot that we can do to start to release some of that. We can't ever fully jump out of the tank. I wish
I was about to say, how do we
get
get out of or change the fish tank?
So we can change the tank, excitingly. So in the way that I just said, we teach social norms as mothers. So we do socialize our children. And if we aren't conscious and aware of how the social rules of motherhood operate, we can unconsciously perpetuate these shoulds onto them in terms of their beliefs around what it means to be a good mother. What we can also do, though, is that we can pass on strategies of resistance. That looks like questioning, that looks like curiosity, that looks like modeling, that looks like lots of things, right? But actually how we raise our children is part of changing the tank, because motherhood will look different for them in their generation, right? We don't have a ton of control over it, but we can influence it. And how I frame this is, if you imagine those fish in the tank swimming around and you start kind of swimming into the edge of the tank over and over and again, and you're creating a little crack. And I like to also take this a bit further by saying it's not just you doing that, but you get a group of other fish who share similar values, who are mothering in a different way, and you're all swimming together and you're creating a bit of a tidal wave in the water, and bigger cracks are forming. And so that's part of how this is what Andrea O'Reilly and others in this space would say, we mother against motherhood. So we mother and we practice and we live in a way that actually resists some of these social norms and some of these rules. And this doesn't have to look like big work. Sometimes it can. It can look as simple as making sure you're hydrated. You know, as shocking as that is to say, we are at a point in which mothers are so stretched and so pressured and are carrying such an enormous mental load that our basic needs are not being met. and that it can feel like a fight to have those needs met. So starting at the basics of going to the toilet when you need to go to the toilet, drinking water when and noticing your body needs hydration, not eating the scraps of your kids' meals and calling that dinner. Little bits like that, that's all resistance to the social norms of idealized motherhood that we're talking about here. Does that make sense,
It
Karina?
does. And it's very validating, I think, as well, but also makes me think it can actually be quite uncomfortable for people to go through that resistance because we all have our own, as you said, different upbringings, our different cultural backgrounds. And going against that can actually be quite tough, particularly if you're doing something that your mother may not have done and it may look a little bit disrespectful potentially of, well, she did it this way, I'm going to almost do the opposite of actually undoing some of that. So, and just like anything, changes can be quite uncomfortable. So, yeah, how do you also go through that? Because there's a lot, I would say, emotionally and also a lot of resilience in yourself. You need to go, I'm going to do this. It's going to be really tough. Sometimes it's easier to stay in your lane as opposed to, yeah, challenge, I guess, the new norms.
Yeah, absolutely. So I would say two things to that. One is that you pay costs either way. We need to choose which costs we're willing to bear. So the costs of staying the same and of holding on to good mothering ideology or the perfect mother myth is how we can frame it. The cost to that, depletion, burnout, loss of identity, we know from a plethora of research, lower life satisfaction for mothers, high incidences of anxiety, depression, maternal rage, fractured relationships, and essentially keeping on going on the treadmill where others' needs are met and we are in service of others, but we are barely staying together.
What
And
can we do? Like, how can we start to even just in ourselves and say, look, no, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to challenge the motherhood norm.
so I would say that the second part of in terms of what cost is there to pay is to go, where can I start small here? And usually that doesn't actually happen with action. It happens through self-reflection and challenging our belief systems. So if this is, if someone is listening to this podcast interview and this is the first time that you've heard about the perfect mother myth or the social construction of motherhood, I would say you don't need to do anything with this yet. Like, give yourself time and space. An exercise that you can do to start to unearth your own socialization is to either, there's two different ways you can go about it, but write down the sentence, a good mother is, a good mother does, a good mother looks like, a good mother feels, a good mother doesn't feel. Fill out the rest of those sentences. What would come to mind? This isn't necessarily asking about your own personal values and beliefs. That will be part of it. But we're asking about what your society paints the picture of a good mother as. So if you have an alien drop down from Mars and they're like, hey, tell me about what a perfect mother is in your culture, what would you say? And if we were together in a classroom and we were to start yelling out different answers about this, we have a shared understanding of this. A good mother doesn't lose it with her children. She has endless patience. It comes easily and naturally to her. She becomes a mother at a particular age range. So she's not too young because that's irresponsible, but she's not too old because then she's a geriatric mother, right? In terms of our labeling, that's something we have to contend with.
They do to call them, yep.
Yeah. She's not a single mother. So she's assumed to be partnered. She's assumed to be heterosexual. She's assumed to be white and middle class. She's assumed to not have a disability. Her child is a quote unquote good child. Her child doesn't have additional needs. Her child meets the markers of, do you have a good baby? Yes, I have a good baby. How are they sleeping through the night? We have particular social scripts that are employed and deployed over and over to denote what it means to be a good mother. And part of that depends on and relates to the good child. And that's what trips us up, because a lot of everything that I'm talking about here is made up. It's a myth. There's no one mother who fits this. There's no one child who's the perfect child. It's all just stereotypes and archetypes. But if we could spend the whole podcast episode pulling out all of the different shoulds that exist around idealized motherhood. And part of that too is it asks us to deny certain parts of ourselves. It asks us to deny our anger, to deny our sadness, to deny our distress, to deny our regret, potentially, to sometimes actually deny our fulfillment, right? Because we're not supposed to lose ourselves in motherhood. We're supposed to bounce back. We're supposed to just get on with life as if we've integrated this little being and we know how to do it. It's instinctual. It comes naturally. But part of what the myth also does is it traps us because it says contradictory things sometimes. So it says, for example, Be with your child 24/7. You're fully responsible, and giving your child to anyone else for them to be responsible for their care is an abdication of your mothering and will
Yeah.
harm your child in some way. Yet, we're also told, so what do you do? Oh, you're just a mother?
Yeah.
Conversation ends. Right. So this is how it works as a social construction. We have the platforming and the idealization and the valorizing, and we have the pull down. And this is called the good mother, bad mother binary. And that's how this continues, because there is no way for you to hack this. There is no way for you to actually mother in a way that allows you to get it right. So what you can do is you can do this exercise of starting to explore what are some of the beliefs that you've taken on. And after you've written out a big long list or a few paragraphs, I would go through every single one, like some of the ones I just mentioned there, and question for yourself, is this a value that comes from you and that is in support of your family and yourself? Or is this something that you've been handed down as a social rule? Really silly little examples could be when you grew up, you were told you were to never jump on the couch and you'd get in trouble if you did that. And children, that's, being too rowdy or wild or out of control and, you don't have control of your kids, whatever. Maybe you really don't care about that. You're like, whatever, jump on the couch, go for your life. Okay, get rid of that one.
Yeah.
Like, that's a trivial example, but this can actually be really insidious, and it can come about in like every different section of our day. There can be different parts of it here, through to cooking, through how we engage with our children, through things that we're saying, through it is everywhere when we start to open our eyes to it. And that's why I said, don't put pressure on yourself to take any action, because actually your consciousness raising and your awareness is like 90% of the work. Because once you start questioning and realizing little bits here and there, oh, I wonder why I feel guilty there, or, oh, can I outsource this? Can I ask for help with this? Sometimes we even have offers of help and our reaction is to say, no, it's fine. I'll do it. Where did that come from? Can I pause and allow myself to respond a little bit? Can I allow myself to receive? So there's all sorts of different ways that this can look, but I'd say just noticing first and looking really gently at what are a couple of little things I could do that are already routinized in my week that I could shift just a little bit. And you don't have to frame that as pushing back against cultural norms, because sometimes that feels too big at first, but that is what you're doing. So, it can help also to be reminded of, you're doing this for yourself, but you are also doing this for your children as well. It benefits them as well. It's not a taking away from them.
And it's amazing as well. Like once you started doing this, I've particularly over the last 12, 18 months, I've been doing a lot more work on my mindset. And it's funny when sometimes I know for myself, mum guilt will creep up and appear. And I'm there going, where's this come from? Where's the guilt coming from? What are the stories that I'm telling myself to make myself feel guilty? And you're going, oh no, this is really crazy, because there is no actual evidence. It's just the culture, the water, you would say, that's around me that is wanting me to feel guilty and what I've been told, as opposed to the evidence. There is no evidence. Your children are fine and you're fine. So why have that guilt? But it's amazing how much, yeah, when you start doing that self-reflection exercise, it can be so powerful as well. And even, as what you said earlier around the mental load, as soon as you start reflecting on, why do I have to do this task? Can I, share it with my partner or outsource and things like that? As soon as you start going, yeah, I can, it can also make things so much lighter as well. And there's so much, I don't know what it is in Western culture, women feel that we need to do everything. Asking for help is sometimes seen as a weakness, when really, in fact, it should be seen as a strength. We're actually agreeing to ask for help and get support, and all these shoulds that we tell ourselves, which are just so wrong. So
Yeah, and look, it's tricky, because in order to go through transformation of belief systems that then are followed by action, it's not being realistic. It's probably not going to happen from listening to this one podcast episode and then you can completely change your life. Like, it usually requires a commitment to deep learning, which is best done in containers and in relationship. So whether that be through in a friendship and you both decide to listen to a series of podcasts and discuss them with each other, whether it be through conversations with a mother's group, whether it be through a therapist, through a coach, in a mother's group that is facilitated by a therapist or coach trained in this area, it often requires doing inquiry alongside others to be able to see reflected in them parts of yourself and to be able to do this together, because all of this is bigger than us.
Mm.
And those questioning sometimes of, well, why do I feel this way? Or where can this come from? And you might have evidence that actually I don't need to feel this way, but sometimes that's not enough. Sometimes you need a little bit more than that in order to shift a belief. But I think the other thing that I would say about that is that for some people, holding on to the perfect mother myth can actually feel like almost like a protection or a safety blanket or a comfort, because it helps provide rules and structure around how to mother. And if you've come from an upbringing, or you identify yourself as a perfectionist, or you may come from a corporate background or a career where you have worked to particular tasks, where you have KPIs, where you have things that are actually quite measurable, it can feel comforting to come into motherhood and have a similar form of structure to help measure yourself against. So if you are somebody who identifies yourself in that way, sometimes that's an indicator that it might take a little bit more support in order to be able to work through and create some shifts in your life, because it's really understandable. We walk into becoming a mother. It's like you walk through fire sometimes, and there's lots of grief along the way, and loss, and conflicting feelings. And you can feel, I think I talk about this sometimes, it's like you've taken a step off a cliff, and as you're falling down, you're trying to catch and hold on to things to anchor you. And sometimes the perfect mother myth is that, and it's what you're holding on to. And so that's why sometimes this work isn't for you. If you're in the early stages of postpartum, then it might not be the right time to do this deep inquiry. But chipping away a little bit, and even anyone who's made it this far in this episode, you've got enough inquiry and curiosity within yourself to be able to hold this as a seed throughout your mothering, and then see what grows from that in time.
Yeah, and there's certainly no rule books with motherhood, and it's certainly no guidebooks. It's not like you can go off to university and study what it's like to be a mum, because it's every child is different, every situation, and you're dealt with things that you would never experience. I know that my children have pushed me, and I've experienced probably the worst elements of my life, particularly when I had to do a pregnancy for a termination for medical reasons. Like, that's pushed me to the absolute edge. But then I've also had the best times. But if someone had told me 7 years ago, this is what you go through, I would have gone, nah, what are you talking about? It's so different to what it is. And appreciating as well, every day, every moment is also going to be different. It's going to test you in ways that you've never been tested before, but also allowing that to be okay, because there's also, as you're saying, the perfect mother myth of you've always got it together, when really, in fact, it's not. And what is the good enough myth? The good enough mother myth? Because it's reality, I guess, that it's okay to not have all the balls perfectly in the air, and being good enough is actually pretty good, isn't it?
Yeah, so the good enough concept is one that was developed originally by Donald Winnicott, who was a pediatrician and a psychoanalyst. And part of where this theory came from, and it's been used in a whole range of ways, but part of what it came from was through observing the interactions between mothers and babies and their children, and understanding that actually it's not, sometimes there's a misunderstanding of the good enough mother myth, because it sounds like a settling, like I'll be good enough, like, oh, I'll be just a good enough mother. And people can hear that and kind of be like, well, that might be okay for those other mothers, but I'm giving my child the best. And so that's not what the theory means. What it means is that with our children, there is a period, particularly around infancy in the early stages and years, where there is almost a level of infatuation that can come about with your baby. There's a high level of attunement that can happen, and we're designed for that. Primary caregivers are designed to be able to attune to your baby, respond to their needs as best that you can. Over time, though, and usually this starts often in toddlerhood, there are ruptures that start to happen and this happens as well. We see this in research of mothers who have multiple children, where there is an acceptance that I can't actually meet all of their needs. I can't be perfectly attuned to all of these children at one time. But what happens in terms of the relationship are there are these misattunements, and that's actually is happening from infancy. There's research by Ed Tronick that looks at this, and they find that we can only actually be in connection with our children. This goes for relationships more broadly, but we can only be in connection and meet them and respond to what their needs are about 1/3 of the time.
Wow.
Another third of the time, we are in misattunement. So we're actually, quote unquote, failing them. We're misreading them. We're missing their cues. We're not meeting them in the ways that they're asking to be met. And then another third of the time, we're in repair with them. So we've had a misattunement and we're back in repair and in connection. We're going, okay, how can we come back into connection here in relationship? And what has been interesting is that repair third develops stronger bonds and attachment than the initial meeting them. Okay, so in order for our children to grow and develop into healthy, independent, as much as we can be, healthy adults, they need misattunement. They need ruptures and repairs. They need to experience that in safe, consistent, stable relationships. And so we're doing that, we're failing them whether we like it or not. I mean, it's basically like take that as
once we accept that, where it's okay.
Once you accept that, it's okay. Our job as parents is not to make our children constantly happy. It's not to constantly meet their needs. We're in relationship with them. And so that is fluid. It's flexible. It needs to be agile. It requires self-reflection from us, but it also requires a level of acceptance that there are going to be times when our children are disappointed. There's going to be times when we let them down. There's going to be times when we do things that require us to apologize to our kids, to model to them what apology looks like, what self-reflection looks like, this is how mummy's going to try and do it differently next time, what that actually looks like. We're modeling all of that for them in relationship with them. And so part of what the Good Enough Mother as a concept tries to communicate is that it's not just that we can't be perfect and therefore let's settle for good enough. It's that if we strive for perfection, we will inevitably fail. We know that. But if we're doing so and we're failing while we're holding that report card to ourselves that we're doing a bad job, it actually becomes detrimental for our children and ourselves. And so if we were to run with the line of let's model perfection for our children, what does that set them up for? They're human beings. They're going to fail. They're going to struggle. That's the nature of what it means to be human, right? We grapple with a lot of hard stuff. And so we're not doing them any favors by pretending that we can hold up the world perfectly for them. And even if we could, we try and avoid trauma with our kids. We can't.
We can't. It's inevitable.
We can't. It's inevitable.
There's too many unknowns that come about that you can't plan for everything. There's only so many elements you can plan, but there's so many decisions that you have to make each and every moment.
Yeah, there is. And the point of this is saying that it's not, our children aren't projects that we get to mold and create the futures for. You know, we're here in relationship with them, doing the best that we can to give them strong foundations of a strong, healthy attachment and relationships that model for them what it means to be human and what it means to repair and to come back into connection. So look, the Good Enough Mother has been used in a whole variety of different ways, but what I hope to emphasize in that as well is the importance, and this is not so much Donald Winnicott's work, but some of it, and Rosika Parker is somebody who talks about this in a way that I think is really powerful, to say that actually good enough and being in relationship with our children and being gentle on ourselves and knowing that it's about trying, failing, coming back into connection, trying again, repairs, that actually is important not only for the child's development, but also for the mother's development. So it's in relationship with our children that we can start to know and explore and strengthen different parts of ourselves and our own identities as mothers and as women separate from our mothering roles. To know that actually being in relationship with our children and our matrescence journeys can be catalysts or portals for our own self-development and for our own sense of being in the world in a way that is authentic and that confronts some of the raw and difficult experiences that come with being a mother as well, but that doesn't brush them under the rug and say, well, I have to hide that. You know, there can be a lot of shame in motherhood that comes from upholding the perfect mother myth. So good enough, I hope listeners can hear this as permission to allow yourself to be a little more human, to know the work that you're doing is incredibly important. Mothering's not nothing. Mothering is work. It requires intellectual labor, emotional labor. You're grappling with ethical decisions all of the time. We're attuning. That's a lot of work. That's mental and emotional work and labor, and that's worth something. That's valuable. But there's no getting it right here. all of us are just doing our best in the circumstances we find ourselves and in the position of the tank that we're in. Some people have more like seaweed and more things entangling them around them that can make it harder for them to mother than others. So your socioeconomic position is also an important thing to think about here too.
Yeah, definitely. So much in that, and also so validating as well. And everyone has their own second set of circumstances. And I'm sure that in any job that you do, nothing's ever perfect. Like it's that notion, but also the permission that you don't have to be there. But also, I liked what you were saying about that, almost that continuous learning. You're learning from the prior experiences in those situations. I know you talked about bringing on a second child. No one ever prepared me for what it was like to have a second child. Everyone was like, "Oh, how exciting." I'm like, emotionally, having a second child was so challenging in like the first couple of months. Had a baby that really needed me and a 2.5-year-old that also emotionally needed me in two very different ways. And I remember losing it one night and I was like, and it really surprised me, my reaction. I haven't done it since, but it also really heightened to me going, oh my goodness, like two kids, there's a lot there that we also don't talk about as well, of the journey and the emotional, you know, bandwidth that kids are exhausting. And that, but there's so much as well that we learn, as you're saying, doesn't always say on a job resume saying, translate into it, but the emotional intelligence and things like that we're picking up does also then have a roll-on effect into many other areas of our lives in such a positive way. So, motherhood on the resume should actually be seen as a strength and not as a weakness, just because of the skills and things like that we pick up on our journey, as what you said around matrescence as well, our own identity and that coming into it. I remember when I first heard the term matrescence, I was like, a light bulb had gone off in my life, and it was so validating as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, motherhood is absolutely an advantage in terms of the skills that you develop and the experiences that you go through. And yet we know that the motherhood penalty means that mothers are penalized in the workplace, as you're aware of, Karina. Like it's really, there's a massive gap between the support that mothers need, the recognition that they need, and the value they deserve, and the reality of what it is that they're living and having to confront. And when you describe being in that experience of having a newborn and a 2.5-year-old and losing it, it's very understandable as to why you would. We're not designed to mother alone. We're designed to mother in community. We're supposed to have allo carers, allo parents, other people who can step in and share the load. And a 2.5-year-old is still an infant, with infancy defined as the first 3 years of life. So one person actually can't meet all of the needs, or even attempt to meet all of the needs of both children in that way. So you're going to be stretched to your capacity. And it's very understandable as to why you would feel that way. And I think this level of validation can actually sometimes be the first step in even supporting mothers to be able to implement strategies that may prevent them from, quote unquote, losing it at their children, because they can catch themselves earlier. And a lot of what happens, because I've done a lot of work in the space of maternal rage and anger, a lot of what can happen, it's this concept called the anger guilt trap. Someone can just Google Sophie Brock anger guilt trap, and I've got a free training on it. But what happens is all of these shoulds from the perfect mother myth, they embed and bury themselves down so far into our consciousness, and we take them on as beliefs, that when we notice ourselves, quote unquote, failing or not able to do it, it's like a kettle boiling, or it's like the drip, drip, dripping of a tap. And then eventually there will be some trigger point at which it will erupt or explode or overflow. And often that trigger point comes through our children. So Anne Lamott says, if you need a reason to yell, your kids will give you one. So because mothering and care work is hard and it's demanding. And so often that happens, and then there'll be an overflow of rage or expression of anger in ways that might not be that healthy for you and for your children. And then immense guilt following that. And then what do we do with that guilt? We can should on ourselves even harder, according to the perfect mother myth, and it goes around in a cycle. So part of what I hope we can do in this conversation is to start to break down that perfect mother myth a little bit. And what that does is it can help to lower the volume of the voices in your own head that are berating you. And when we can do that, we can also create more space to bring in strategies to support our nervous systems, to support our mental health when we are stretched and in circumstances that we know, hey, I'm finding this hard because this is hard. And now what can I do with this?
Yeah. And so what are some tools and tips? I know you could probably go on for hours on this, but just quickly, maybe 3 tips to support mothers and being realistic with themselves about how they can be a good enough mother and really start to lose that perfect mother myth and back themselves with their own beliefs and in the situation they're at in that moment?
So I'll give you 3 general tips, and I'll say that these probably need to be more specific to whoever's listening in terms of the age of children, your stage, all of these other different
Yeah.
factors. But in a really, really broad way, I would say first to do that exercise of writing out the perfect mother myth and all of the shoulds, because that brings forth and makes visible what you're carrying invisibly. So that would be the first step that I would name. The second that I would do is actually around, so the first is contextualization. The second is validation. So actually naming out on a piece of paper, on a spreadsheet, in the notes section of your phone, whatever, all of the things that you do in your mothering and all of the things that you're holding in your head. So like, when are your kids next due to go see the dentist? What shoe size are they each? What's their friendships at school like at the moment, and where are they struggling? What are you thinking about in terms of their food? Blah, 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 blah. All of the stuff that you hold in your head that like is seemingly invisible and you're doing a lot of work on, you probably don't even realize is work. So basically getting out, again, this is a process of making the invisible visible. And what this does is it can help to provide your self-validation and value what it is you're doing. And B, it can help in the distributing or delegating some of those tasks. Some of them also you might be able to get rid of. So understanding what your beliefs are, contextualization, making visible the invisible and valuing your work, doing a little bit of offloading or readjustments and arranging if you can there. And then the third thing I would say is actually unrelated really to the first two, although it's not in reality, but it's to ask yourself the question, where am I creative in my life? Using the broadest definition of creativity. Where do you make something of nothing? Where do you express yourself? Where are you moving either your body or your hands in a way that transmutes energy? So examples of this, it could be gardening, dancing, poetry, journaling, singing. It could look like a whole range of things. Yes, more traditionally, it could look like painting, drawing, scribbling, knitting, crocheting, weaving, anything that you could define as creative in the broader sense of the word. Where are you doing that? And if you're not doing that, how can you bring that into your life in a small way, even 5 minutes a day? Because that is a piece that so many mothers miss out on, and that I think we need, because we're all creative beings in some way, and we need to reclaim little slices of our life and of our time and of our energy that are for us and that express something within us and through us. And ideally, if we can use our hands or our bodies in doing that, that's also a really powerful preventative measure for maternal anger and for moving through some of the resentment that builds when we're living within a system that's not been built for us.
Amazing. Oh, that's such good tips. And if you're doing that, feel free to DM Sophie or I and just say, look, I've done it. I'd love to hear how you go through that process. So Sophie, what's your vision for motherhood?
Big question, Karina.
I know.
Look, my vision for motherhood is one that is self-claimed and self-defined by mothers. It's really tempting to pull down the perfect mother myth and to say we need a replacement for it, and here is what it is. Here's what liberated motherhood looks like. But what can end up happening, and this can sometimes happen with good enough mothering as well, is we kind of go, okay, you tell me that being a good enough mother is better than being the perfect mother. Well, I am going to be the best good enough mother that I can be. And so we can end up creating new cages for ourselves when we're trying to escape one.
Yeah.
And so that's why I would say that motherhood, I hope we get to a space where mothers are valued and recognized for the important work that they're doing. I think that part of the importance of that is actually naming what we're doing, that externalizing piece that I mentioned in step 2 or tip 2. I hope we can get to a space where, depending on where listeners are in the world, we'll have different kind of parental leave policies in place. But I hope we get to the space where mothering is economically valued and that caregiving and unpaid care work is economically valued and supported. I hope that we get to the place where mothers really do have choice in terms of how they like to live their lives and manage their lives and relationships and passions, because at the moment we often have the illusion of choice, but it's not really when you look at circumstantial constraints. And I hope that mothers feel a level of freedom and feel able to bask in the joy of what it can mean to be a mother without it being cheapened by cultural ideals and valorizations and the hallmark platitudes of self-sacrifice. I hope that we can go beyond that and create a narrative for what it means to be a mother that really focuses on mothers' agency and autonomy and values the work that they're doing in our society.
Oh, amazing. And what a great summary. And fingers crossed that vision one day comes to reality. So before we finish up, is there any other tools or tips or strategies that you'd like or insights that you'd like to share?
I would really just say to go gently, on yourself. If this is a conversation that has sparked some things for you, take away one thing that you would like to try and implement. Jot down a few notes of things that come to mind after listening and challenge yourself to explore one aspect of your motherhood with a lens of curiosity to see what can come from that. And wherever possible, nurture connection between yourself and others, and know that you're doing a wonderful job. And to be a mother in a context and in that fish tank of motherhood as it exists is really hard. And that's why so many mothers are struggling. It's not your fault. It's not because you're not good enough. It's not because you haven't implemented all the mum hacks. It's not because you were never meant to be a mother or that you're failing. Don't compare yourself because you never see the full picture. So just take a moment to really acknowledge and honor all it is that you're doing and all of who you are as well, alongside what you're doing.
Amazing. So well said. And what do you do, Sophie, for creativity and to fill your cup? Because I know being a single mum, it can also be quite full on as well.
Yeah, so part of what I do for my own creative expression and practice is I write poetry. So I do a lot of writing for myself privately, and that can sometimes meld into my work as well. I really love my work. I find it to be a really big creative outlet in terms of education creation as well. I also love walking, listening to podcasts, catching up with my friends. A lot of my cup filling comes through being in relationship with those I'm connected with and close with. And more recently, since my daughter's been a bit older, I love getting away for time away, a couple of nights away in a hotel by myself or with a friend. And having that mentally is coming up too is what's also helpful. So building in some sort of rhythm to our creative practices can help us in moments where we're feeling stifled or feeling overwhelmed to know that, okay, we have got something coming up for us and a little slice of space coming up for us. It may not look like a weekend away, may look like 20 minutes
Yeah.
out by yourself on a walk. And sometimes it can look like things in connection with our children too. It doesn't always have to look like things separate from them. So I have a lot of enjoyment of being present with my daughter. We're heading off to a concert next weekend together, and I really try and integrate what it is that lights me up into my life rather than trying to siphon it off, if that makes sense, in terms of where's my self-care, how's it going to fit in. I try and think about each day, what are some things that are going to light me up and bring me energy today.
Yeah, I can totally relate. I've got two boys that are just pretty active. And even yesterday, I took them for a bike ride, and going with both of them was certainly lighting me up. So I know exactly what you mean in that sense. So,
Yeah.
Sophie, how can people get in touch with you if they want to hear more and find out all about the amazing work that you do?
Yeah, so I also was thinking, Karina, I'm like, I think I said at the start of this interview that I went back to bed for a little bit
Yeah,
of time. And I'm like, that's an example. I wouldn't have scheduled that nap in, but I'm like, what do I need right now? And what do I have capacity for? This is it. So
exactly.
finding slices wherever we can. Yeah, so I have a podcast called the Good Enough Mother podcast. So that's probably the best place for people to start if they want to dive a little bit more into this work. I post a lot on social media and have a lot of content there that people can scroll through to learn a bit more about these concepts. The majority of the work that I do now is supporting professionals who work with mothers. So I have a certification program and a couple of other professional development programs to help with that, with a hope that that enables this work to across the world and for mothers to be able to get the support that they need and to feel the way that I think they deserve to feel in their motherhood.
Well, amazing. Thank you so much for the chat. And also, I want to say publicly, thank you very much for your patience in recording this. It has been interrupted a couple of times thanks to a little person in the sidelines, but thankfully for the last half an hour, he's been Bluey to the rescue. So thank you very much, Sophie, for your patience. And also, thank you very much for all the amazing work that you do, not only supporting all the professionals, supporting other mothers, but also for the, even what you post on social media and also the research you're doing. And also certainly makes things really validating for a lot of mothers out there. And I know myself included, and you can see this actually definitely coming more into the forefront, around the world and definitely in Australia of having the conversations and the awareness of, getting rid of that perfect mother myth and the good enough mother and things like that. So it's really validating, I think, for thousands of women and no doubt millions of women for the work that you're doing and the impact that you're having in such a ripple way. So thank you so much on behalf of everyone as well. It's been a great chat. And as I said, I think offline, you were definitely on my bucket list to have one day on the podcast. So thank you very much. It's been an absolute honor.
Thank you, Karina. I appreciate it. And I love that your little one came in because it's stressful for you. I know because I've been there, but it also just, puts into practice, as we spoke about off air, that really the reason why we're doing all of this is not to put out, another script for people to pick up. It's because this is a reflection of our lived experience. And the more authentic we can be, I think the more of service we can be. So I appreciate it. Thanks for having me on.
My pleasure. Thank you for listening to the Working Mumma podcast. Subscribe to the podcast on iTunes, Spotify, or your favorite podcast catcher. Please also feel free to contact me on any of the Working Mumma social channels. Remember, Mumma is MUMMA, or website www.workingmumma.com.au. I would appreciate you to share this podcast with friends and colleagues, especially those that are parents managing the juggle. And I would really appreciate if you had to take the time out to leave a review of the podcast. Thank you and see you next time. Have a great week.